welcome. In today's episode, I'm going to share encounters where people aren't quite sure what they had the misfortune of crossing paths with. These stories include a man who has had two eerie experiences in Minnesota, a young man who was stalked by something while out fishing one day, and a young man and his girlfriend who seem to have infringed upon a creature's territory, and it responds by intimidating them to leave. But first, we start with a story that was emailed in by a subscriber who had a terrifying experience while hiking one day where the creature involved not only followed him home, but he caught it watching him through the window. I'd like to thank Damien for sharing his story with me and allowing me to share it with you. Alright, let's get into today's stories. The first story of this episode comes to us from a subscriber who emailed in his story. I'll be the first to say that this one has me a little perplexed as to what he saw that day many years ago. I'd once again like to thank Damien for emailing in his story and letting me use it in this episode. Damien lives in British Columbia, Canada, more specifically in the Okanagan region. He was around 13 years old when his encounter took place. He lived on the outskirts of his city in a home that had woods standing approximately 60 feet away from his backyard. In the immediate proximity of his house, right next to his home as a matter of fact, a trail began that ran up the mountain and into the woods. This trail was quite popular, frequented by both locals and horse owners from his neighborhood who would often go for walks up the trail to a hiking spot. Damien too enjoyed exploring the trail, and the constant presence of people on it made him feel safe and unafraid to venture into the woods alone. As he set out on a hike one morning, the trail was mostly deserted, with him encountering only a few people along the way. However, as he proceeded deeper into the wilderness, pretty far away from his home, an unnerving sensation crept over him. It was the distinct feeling of being watched. He says it wasn't necessarily a dangerous feeling, but rather the feeling of being intently observed by something. Being that he is someone who is open-minded about cryptids and the like, his immediate instinct was to leave. This was due to the fact that he wasn't sure what exactly was watching him, whether it be an animal or otherwise, but he did not want to take any chances. So he turned and started heading back down the trail. He didn't rush, but he did go at a faster pace than he did on his way out there. Throughout his entire journey back, he had the sensation of being intently watched, a feeling he says he never lost on his way home. When Damien reached the end of the trail, he made his way across his front yard and into his house. He didn't tell anyone about his experience because nothing really happened on the trail, but an unsettling feeling still lingered in his gut. Fast forward to when it was getting dark out and Damien had forgotten all about his earlier incident. He was in the kitchen washing dishes when that same unnerving feeling he had gotten during his hike returned. He felt as if he was being watched. He looked out the window above the sink and saw something strange near the fence separating the trail from his backyard. Reflected by the light of a distant streetlight, he made out a pair of eyes behind a tree. They were fixed directly on him through the window. He says they appeared to be at the height of a dog, and he could make out a shadow that resembled a large dog-like figure. The presence this creature was giving off left him with an intense feeling that wasn't necessarily dangerous, but that this thing was extremely alert and aware. Left feeling weirded out, Damien placed the dishes he was holding into the sink and looked back out the window to try to get a better look at this thing. But as soon as he moved, the creature rose to stand at an unnaturally tall height. He says it looked like a very large animal had just pushed itself up from a resting or crouched position to standing, but it did so in one smooth motion while maintaining eye contact with him. When it rose up into a standing position on four legs, it was about the size of a full-grown horse. However, Damien could see in the light that it had long fur. This sight had him extremely freaked out by this point, so he sprinted toward the sliding glass door to get a closer look. However, in the brief time it took him to traverse the kitchen and reach the door, the creature, whatever it was, had completely vanished. The eerie sensation of being watched had begun to fade, but he could still feel it. He then went around and shut all the blinds before waiting for his father to get home from work, feeling uneasy the entire time. When his father eventually arrived, he recounted the unsettling incident, but his father told him it was probably just a horse and that he freaked himself out for no reason. But Damien knows what he saw that day, and he knows that it was not a horse. This was due to the fact that it had long fur and had front-facing eyes like a predator. He ends his story by saying that he never encountered this thing again, and he never felt like he was being watched on that trail again either. But he did go down the trail a lot less frequently after his encounter. He also adds that he has no idea what this thing could have been, and nobody believes him when he tells his story. When I asked Damien for more details about the creature, like if he could see the shape of this thing's head or how long the fur was, he told me that it appeared based on the position of this thing's eyes, that the head was level with its torso or its neck was bent down in such a way that he couldn't discern the shape of its head. If it had visible ears, they weren't protruding from the top of its head like that of a deer, so they would have been concealed in the shadowy mass like the head. The fur didn't appear to be incredibly long, but it was long enough that he could see it hanging off the body, similar to the coat of a Samoyed dog, but less fluffy and more sleek. The most unsettling thing for him, he says, was when it stood up onto 4 long skinny legs with an incredibly smooth motion. Unlike most quadrupeds that require a few unsteady seconds to regain their balance, this creature's movement was remarkably fluid. The way it stood up seemed very unnatural to him, especially when compared to local quadrupeds in his area. When I first read his story, I thought perhaps that this was a dogman due to how he described it as looking like a very large dog, and I told him as much. But after hearing his further explanation, especially the way this thing stood up onto 4 legs and was the size of a horse, I'm not so sure it was a dogman. To this, Damien told me that he had been watching a lot of dogman videos lately, and he also thinks that it perhaps was not one. He does say that some bits of his experience are similar, but there are a few key differences that stand out to him. These details make him wonder what else this thing might have been. He fully believes that it was a cryptid of some sort due to the intense feeling of being watched and how it followed him home before continuing to watch him through the window. Then there is how it vanished without a trace when he tried to get a better look at it. As for my thoughts on this one, I'm going to share what I told Damien. For him to not only feel like he was being watched, but to have this thing follow him to his house, that's what makes these things so terrifying, at least in my opinion. To be able to stay out of sight and track him back to his home is just scary. I always say to trust your gut and to get out of there if things don't feel right. I'm just glad he did not hesitate. There's no telling what might have happened if he hadn't left the area when that feeling came over him. I've heard stories where parents actually do know what is lurking out there or have seen or experienced something themselves, but tell their children it's nothing or give them another explanation so as not to scare them. I'm not saying this is what Damien's father was doing, but it is one possible explanation. Or maybe he thought since his son was so young that he was making more out of what he saw than what was actually there. As for me, I believe Damien, and I definitely think whatever this thing is was a cryptid. This is due to him feeling like he was being watched along with the unsettling feeling and something not quite feeling right to him on the trail. The fact that he said it looked like a very large dog made me think it could have been a dogman. That was my initial thought when reading his story. But like I told him, I've got to be honest here. I'm not sure what this thing could have been. I'm actually really perplexed by this, and it makes this story that much more interesting to me. Another thing I want to mention here is something that Damien said to me that I hear in a lot of other stories too. He told me he appreciated talking with me about this because it's strange to talk to people who are skeptical that things like this exist, and that it's always awkward when you can tell someone doesn't believe you. Like I said, I've heard this so many times while researching cryptids. People sometimes feel alone after having an encounter because they don't have anyone to talk to, and it's usually for the same reasons Damien gave, everyone being skeptical and/or not believing them. One reason I started this channel was to create a place where people can listen to stories, tell their own, and discuss them without the fear of being ridiculed, mocked, or not believed. Encounters like this are traumatizing to say the very least, and holding everything you feel in after having one can really wear on a person. It's good to get it out, but more importantly to be taken seriously and not just dismissed when telling your story. That's why people so often turn to sharing their stories online and seek others who have had similar experiences. I want anyone who comes to this channel or emails me to know that I will take them seriously and they will definitely not be ridiculed or mocked here, at least if I can help it. What do you think about Damien's encounter, and what do you think the creature that followed him home might have been? The next story comes to us from Minnesota, where one poster shared two experiences in which he isn't sure what exactly he had the misfortune of crossing paths with either time. He doesn't say where exactly in Minnesota he lives, just that it's in the middle of nowhere near the state's northern border. He also mentions that he grew up taking part in all kinds of outdoor activities such as hunting, fishing, and trapping. He also says he has seen and heard weird things while partaking in these activities. However, there are two experiences that he says still shake him to this very day. The first time he encountered something strange was during winter while he was still in high school, and by his own admission, it wasn't too bad. He and his friends had gone shopping in the nearest, quote, big town as he puts it, in the area where he lives. He says the population of the town is approximately 10,000 people. As they were headed back home, they were talking and having a good time. Then, suddenly, he noticed a tall figure out of the corner of his eye. It was standing in a small field next to a telephone pole. Everyone in the car fell silent at that moment. This figure, as described by the original poster, was at least halfway up the pole and completely white. The rest of the way home, he and his friends were silent. When he dropped off one of his friends, he asked everyone if they had seen that thing too, and they all answered that they had. He says that none of them ever talked about that experience again, not even to this day. The second incident took place during a coyote hunting expedition with the OP and another group of his friends. This one, he says, was way scarier than the first. On the night of the encounter, it was approximately 3 in the morning and again during winter, but he says it wasn't very cold out. They were all out in a field owned by the parents of one of his friends calling for prey. They did this for about an hour when suddenly they all heard the distinct sound of trees snapping and breaking, but strangely there was no eye shine when they scanned the tree line with their red lights. About 20 minutes later, after packing up all their gear into their trucks, they left. As he drove, leading the way, something to his right caught his attention. He says he saw a massive dog-like creature keeping pace with them. Upon seeing this running alongside their trucks, he sped up, driving back to town as fast as he could. He reached a gas station not long after where the other truck containing the rest of his group was. They all confirmed having witnessed the creature following them. The next day, his friend revealed to him that the field where they had been was in native land and supposedly haunted. He ends his post by saying that he isn't sure what he saw in either of his encounters, but he still has nightmares about both creatures. I've always said that people are unlucky when they have just one cryptid encounter, but to have two? I think I would be moving away from that area. Jokes aside though, even though the first encounter was nothing more than the group seeing something standing by the side of the road as they drove past, it was enough that it silenced them the rest of the way back home. That's how traumatizing a sighting like this can be, even if it is just a quick glimpse of something as you drive by. Not only do I think the sheer shock of seeing something like that, but the fact that these things aren't supposed to exist. The effect this thing, whatever it was, standing by the side of the road had on the group speaks volumes. Then the poor OP had another encounter, with this one being even more traumatizing than the first. I couldn't imagine seeing one of these creatures, much less have it chase me. I don't think I'd be going back to that area if I were him. I can see why he says both encounters still have an effect on him to this day. Some stories result in the people having the encounters developing PTSD. I hope that's not the case here though, and I'm glad the encounters didn't escalate or take a more negative turn of events like some do. As for what he saw, In the first sighting, when he saw a white figure that stood halfway up a light pole, he doesn't give much of a description except to say that it was very tall and completely white. Maybe they were going too fast and he only caught a brief glimpse of whatever this thing was, so that's all he was able to see. Given that he lives in northern Minnesota, I first thought of a Wendigo. However, that would be extremely tall for a Wendigo. But who knows, perhaps they can be that tall. But something makes me think that this was not a Wendigo and it was something else entirely. The second encounter seems like it was a dogman. He describes it as being canine-like when it was chasing his truck. He also said that it was massive. However, without further details, I can't say for certain that's what I think it was. What do you think about these encounters? What do you think he saw on each occasion? And did his encounters make you want to stay out of Minnesota? The next story comes from a poster who shared their experience on a post asking for people to share their encounters and what they think they saw. Their story takes place in the Sierra Nevada mountains just outside of a fishing village when he was only 15 years old. He was hiking to a lake to catch some cutthroat trout, and out of nowhere there was a very loud bang. But he didn't pay much mind to it at first because there was a Marine base nearby. However, he says what he heard wasn't the usual sounds of guns, artillery, or aircraft. He is familiar with those sounds, having lived close to two bases. The dog that was accompanying him did not stick around, turning and running away. He and his friend decided to fish for another 15 minutes or so before going to find her. That's when everything went completely silent. There were absolutely no signs of life. Not a single gust of wind, no birds chirping, and not even the buzz of insects. It was as if the world had fallen into a state of absolute stillness. Then the unsettling feeling of being watched and or stalked washed over him. He says here that he has had his fair share of encounters with bears, coyotes, and mountain lions, the big predators you'd expect to find in California. But this was different. Almost like an apex predator was lurking with an impending sense of doom hanging in the air. He couldn't shake the feeling throughout most of his walk back down the trail. He has not returned to the lake since that day and has no desire to uncover the truth behind what he experienced and what might have been out there with him that day. He has heard similar stories happening to others on that same trail. He never told anyone about his experience in the 12 years since it happened, but recently he asked his friend about it and his friend responded by saying, "You felt that too?" I can't count the amount of stories I've heard where someone describes everything going completely still while in the woods and how there seemed to be absolutely no signs of life. In some stories, people describe even the wind or breeze abruptly stopping too. These are clear-cut signs that a cryptid is nearby. He also points out that he knows the normal wildlife in the area and what he experienced felt completely different. Another thing I want to add that I've said before is to pay attention to your pets when they begin acting as if something is off. If my dog took off running, I would have definitely taken notice and followed. Not to mention, it wouldn't have taken me so long to go find her if she did run off, clearly scared of something. I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt though and say his dog probably went there with him a lot and went exploring on its own. But when they run off clearly afraid, it's best to take notice and follow suit, especially if things go completely silent like they did in this story. Also, there was the feeling of being watched as well as the walk back from the lake where they felt like they were being followed. This happens all the times in stories too, and so far in every story in this episode. However, one was giving chase and not stalking, but still. As for what this thing was, I cannot venture a guess because there is no description being that there was not a sighting. But I thought it would be a good one to go over being that it involves 3 different things to pay attention to if you are ever out in the woods and you begin to experience things like they did. What do you think about this one? Have you ever felt like you were being watched in the woods and or followed? The final story of this episode comes to us from Kentucky, where one poster had multiple strange experiences while in the woods. He lives in Moorhead, Kentucky, which is in the eastern part of the state. He took to the internet to find answers as well as to find like-minded people who wouldn't immediately dismiss his story or, in his words, to find some sort of community. He adds that he isn't superstitious and he is very rational in relation to the animals in the region where he lives. His encounters all took place when he was hiking around Eagle Lake or near Cave Run. As he walked, he would hear sounds as if something was approaching. He says it would come much closer than any animal should, but when he reacted to it by stomping his feet or doing anything else, it stopped. Each time, a wave of unshakable dread and intense anxiety washed over him, compelling him to leave the area immediately. Every time this happened and he began to depart, the mysterious entity charged toward him, rapidly closing the distance and essentially chasing him away. After his initial encounter with whatever this thing was, he made the decision to avoid Eagle Lake altogether and opted for a more frequented spot near Cave Run instead. However, the same exact experience repeated itself multiple times after his first encounter, even after he changed hiking locations. No matter where he goes, he cannot escape the feelings he experiences during his encounters. When these things begin to happen, there are no signs of any animals nearby, especially not ones capable of producing the mysterious sounds he hears. Each time this has happened, his girlfriend has been with him and she experiences the exact same eerie sounds and feelings as him. He ends his post by inviting anyone who has experienced the same thing as him to let him know. He then adds an edit with some information. In the edit, he says he is not suggesting that Eastern Kentucky has a new cryptid or that a ghost is stalking him and his girlfriend. He would very much like to believe that it's the same creature behaving the same exact way in 4 different locations, but it's becoming increasingly difficult for him to do so. Both he and his girlfriend are convinced that something there wants them gone. They are avid hikers and have been on countless outings without encountering anything, and they don't have any apprehension about going out. He carries protection so he isn't afraid of the animals that inhabit the area. He closes by saying he posted his story because he would like to hear some experiences from others. I think the OP and his girlfriend are exactly right when they say that both believe whatever is out there wants them gone. There are a ton of stories where people are intimidated like in this story or just outright chased by cryptids who all of a sudden stop chasing them when they could easily catch the people. I, like so many others, believe it's to get the people to leave their territory. For whatever reason, they don't want to harm the person, they just want them gone. This seems to be the case in this story as well. One thing I do find odd is that he changed hiking locations and it kept happening. Perhaps he is right and there is more than one of these creatures out there and he keeps stumbling onto their territories, or there is one who likes and/or requires a lot of space. If I were him, I would try to figure out where they start to feel the intimidation tactics of whatever is out there, whether it be one or multiple creatures, and stay away. In so many stories, people are robbed of places they like to go or activities they like to do because of these creatures. It's good that he and his girlfriend aren't letting this thing rob them of hiking, which they love to do. But I would try to figure out the area which this thing does not want them to come into and try to stay out of it. There's no need to play with fire. What do you think about this one? Do you think that whatever is out there is just guarding its territory? And that's going to do it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed these stories. If you'd like to hear more stories like these and other types of cryptids, make sure to subscribe to the channel. If you want to send me your story, I'd love to read it. My email is wolfwhocriedcryptid@gmail.com. I will also put it in the description below. With your permission, I may want to use it in an episode. Even if you'd prefer that I didn't share your story on my channel and just want someone to listen, email me. We can privately talk about your encounter. And please remember to keep it civil in the comments section. No one deserves to be ridiculed whether they believe or not. Thank you for listening. I'll catch you at the next episode.